so this is the first of 4 classes on the Great Dharani. It's part of the ongoing series of classes on traditional Buddhist chanting. And we're going to start the class with actually chanting the Great Dharani, and then we'll move on from there. Okay, so I'm gonna silence myself and share the screen and play the video of the chant. So tonight we're going to talk about the Great Dharani. Do either of you have any questions or anything you want to bring up before we start? Um, I'm sure in the back of your mind you must have questions about the Great Dharani, and so if those bubble up or if you formulate something while we're going on, please interrupt me and break in. Um, so let's see. Let me share my screen again. Oh, did I? Oh, yeah, it's recording. Yeah, that's right. I see the. I'm going to share my screen again. this is, oh no, that's too far ahead. Okay, so this is what we just chanted. And so this is written out in both um, Hangul, which is the native Korean script, and also spelled out using the standardized romanization for Hangul. So one of the problems with the Great Dharani is that you really have to, when you learn it one syllable at a time, and you don't, so you learn how to pronounce it. And that's the same way that people in Korea and elsewhere in East Asia learn it. They usually learn it just as by the sounds. Now, often people are told that it doesn't mean anything, that the sounds don't mean anything. You just learn the sounds and don't worry about the meaning, or there is no meaning. And that's definitely not true. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about tonight and in all four of the classes is, what are these sounds? So the sounds are originally from Sanskrit. And then what happened was that during the course of the dissemination of Buddhism in East Asia, the Buddhism actually traveled to a bunch of different places in Asia, a lot of places in Central Asia, and often Buddhism did not come directly from India to China. Usually it went by way of places in Central Asia. But eventually it ended up in China. And in China, the Chinese Buddhists translated all of the sutras into Chinese. And so Dharanis come from the sutras. The Dharanis are a part of the Sutrayana, the teachings of the Buddha. Although sometimes Dharanis like this one were not taught directly by the Buddha himself, but by some bodhisattva. And so the Vimalakirti Sutra is mostly the words of Vimalakirti, although the Buddha does appear in it. The Srimala Sutra is mostly the words of Queen Srimala, although the Buddha also appears in it. This Dharani, like the Heart Sutra, is the words of Avalokiteshvara, but that's still considered to be part of the Sutrayana of Mahayana Buddha, the sutras of Mahayana Buddhism. And so the Chinese created a complete version of all the sutras, including all of the Dharani teachings, in Chinese. And then that version was disseminated throughout the rest of East Asia, including to Korea. So places like Korea and Japan and Vietnam took these teachings, and where there were mantras or Dharanis involved, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what those words mean, but only just a little, because it's not really something we should focus on. But I'm just trying to explain why I've got this written out here in Hangul, because as mantras and Dharanis, which were part of Mahayana Buddhism, were spread throughout East Asia, people adopted the Chinese form of the mantras and Dharanis, and that's largely because the mantras and Dharanis by this part were written out now in Chinese characters, and although that's not always the case, but so they were received by the Chinese, who had worked out the way of pronouncing them, which is often it was an attempt to do the Sanskrit pronunciation, but not always precisely, I would say. Just like when we chant, Americans often say, oh, we're gonna, like when we chant the Heart Sutra mantra, Gate Gate Pada Gate Pada Samgate Bodhisvaha. That's not correct Sanskrit pronunciation when I pronounce it, at least. It's an approximation. And if you want to know how to actually pronounce that precisely correctly in Sanskrit, you'd have to study pretty hard for many years. Anyway, so the form that we have of the Great Dharani, for those in the in the Korean Buddhist tradition, and in particular, people who are part of the lineage that goes back to Zen Master Sung San, learn the chant as it's pronounced in Korean, and in Korea, they spell it out in Hangul so that they know how to pronounce it. And so that's what I have here, along with now the spelled out, the phonetically spelled out part that I've got here that goes along with the Hangul is slightly different from what people are usually used to, especially if you're used to the kind of the Kwanum Zen, Zen Master Sung San's officially blessed version of the phonetic pronunciation. This is more in line with the way that people nowadays represent the sounds of Korean using the English alphabet, and in particular, I've taken out all of there are less of hyphens. When you see one of these chanting books, like at Furnace Mountain, or in some Kwanum Center, or any group that is affiliated with or part of the lineage from Zen Master Sung San, and these there's lots of hyphens, and they're kind of arbitrary, and they don't really have any significance. So I've just spelled out the one, every Hangul is a syllable. So anyway, that's why actually for the most part there aren't that many differences. But if you look at this closely, you'll find some differences from what you might be used to. Anyway, all right. So this is a nice quote. This is just a bit of reminiscence from one of Zen Master Sung San's students. And I'm just going to read this. And this kind of gives a feel for the place of the Great Dharani in those who they consider themselves either students of Zen Master Sung San or of one of the teachers that he trained, or in some cases now even like second and third generation of teachers that can trace our lineage back to Zen Master Sung San. So this is from Andrzej Stech, I think is how his name is pronounced. He's a Polish teacher who trained under Zen Master Sung San. And so he said, Zen Master Sung San said many times, I don't teach any technique. I only teach don't know. Which is very typical Zen Master Sung San style teaching. But actually, according to, this is Andrzej Stech speaking it, but actually the Great Dharani was his technique. That was his practice. I just now notice I'm not in the official, let me try to get out of it. Okay, I have to stop sharing for just a second. Here we go. Now I can share again. It's just that when you're not in presentation mode, then you get things like the stupid little lines that are under this but here, where it's trying to make some sort of correction to the grammar. Those all disappear when you go into slideshow or presentation mode. So I'm going to make them disappear now because I find it very annoying. Okay. So Zen Master Sung San said many times, I don't teach anything. I don't teach any technique. I only teach don't know. But actually the Great Dharani was his technique. That was his practice. He got enlightenment by chanting the Great Dharani. And later he kept this Dharani almost all of the time, or I'm not even sure if you can say almost. Being around Zen Master Sung San in Poland, America, or Korea, any Zen center, any temple, he was always the most strongly practicing person in the place. I remember at Hwagesa Temple, which is in Seoul, Korea, where we had wake up at 3:20 a.m. Many of us woke up a little earlier, and whenever any of us looked at Zen Master Sung San's windows, his lights were already on. Then some of us wanted to wake up a little earlier at 2:30. We looked at his windows and still the lights were on. 2 a.m. still. He was the first person in the temple who woke up and practiced. One time I went to him and said, I have this and this problem, lots of thinking. He said, how many bows do you do? And I said, oh, maybe 100 or 200. And he said, that's not enough. Myself, I'm 60 years old, and every single day, 1,000 bows. He would wake up at 2 a.m. and first thing, do 1,000 bows straight. Zen Master Sungsan was not only a teacher, he was a great practitioner. And he was always trying to practice and give us this gift of formal practice. The last conversation I had with him was again about his practice. Somehow I ended up being with him by myself in a hotel room. Everybody disappeared, and it was only the two of us in the room. Whenever I was with him, he would never start talking to me first. He would always keep silent. He was doing his Dharani, of course, and that's what Zen Master Sung was always doing, the Great Dharani, in his mind, silently. We were sitting there for 5 or 10 minutes, not talking. Finally, thinking about how to start a conversation, I said, De Sunsanim, are you doing the Great Dharani right now? He said, yes, of course. I do it all the time. I said, even in your sleep? He said, yeah, even when I'm sleeping, I'm doing it. Even right now, while I'm talking to you. From other sources, we found out that he could do this Great Dharani if he wasn't tired 3 times a minute, which is really fast. When he was a little tired, maybe only 2 times a minute, he was doing this 24/7. He told me for 50 years, I never change. 50 years, never change. Then he said, all my life, I never look back, not even for 1 second. That was his last teaching I got from him. That was the last teaching I got from him. So now, whenever we are chanting this Great Dharani, I think he's doing it wherever he is. If you want to meet him face to face, just chant it one more time. So that's a good teaching. It's a nice story. And it's also, it is, I think, a lot. So we have this very special relationship. Anybody who has a connection to Zen Master Sungsan, whether it's directly, and I only had the opportunity to meet him a few times, or through a teacher like my teacher, Zen Master Degak, whom I've had the opportunity to meet a lot of times. I'm going to go see him in a little over a week personally, and I see him on Zoom a lot. But anyone who has ever practiced with Zen Master Sungsan or practiced with a teacher who trained under Zen Master Sungsan feels a special relationship to the Great Dharani. But one thing that it's kind of funny to find out is that the Great Dharani is hugely popular throughout East Asia. China, Korea, Vietnam, Japan, people love to chant the Great Dharani. Everybody does it. It's actually, along with the Heart Sutra, it's almost certainly like nearly as popular as the Heart Sutra as a practice. And this has been the case for centuries and centuries. There are fascinating stories about the Great Dharani that go back many centuries. So it is cool to have this close connection, by way of Zen Master Sungsan with the Great Dharani. But at the same time, it's also cool that this is a connection that we have with a huge number of ordinary Buddhist practitioners throughout the world. Okay, so this is, I took out the Hangul here, and this is the Great Dharani again. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and just read it and then talk about a little bit more about it, but I'm just going to read it. Shinmyo Jangu De Dharani, Namo Ra Dana Darayaya, Namak Aryak Baro Gije Sebaraya, Moji Sadabaya, Maha Sadabaya, Maha Garo Nigaya, Om Salba Baye Sudara Nagara Ya Dasamyong Namakari. See, if I don't do so, I have to kind of chant it, or else I get lost. Shinmyo Jangu De Dharani, Namo Ra Dana Darayaya, Namakarya Baro Gije Sevaraya, Moji Sadabaya, Maha Sadabaya, Mahagaro Nigaya. Is that right? Moji Sadabaya, Maha Sadabaya, Mahagaro Nigaya. Om Salbabaye Sudarana, Garayada Samyong Namakari Daba, Ima Maria, Barogije Sebarata Baira Ganta, Namakari Nayama Balta, Isami Sabata Sadanam Subana Yeom, Sababodanam Baba Marami Sudagam, Danyata Om Aroge Aroga, Majiroga Jigaranje, Hare Mahamochi Sadaba Samara Samara Harinaya. Guru Gama Sadaya Sadaya Dodo dodo mionje, maha mionje, dara 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 nare sebara. Sebara jara jara mara mi mara amara. Molche ye he he roge sebara. Raami sami nasaya. Saya. Nabe sami sami nasaya. Mohajana mi sami nasaya. Horo horo mara horo hare. Banama nava sara sara shiri shiri soro soro. Mocha mocha modaya modaya. Medariya niraganta gama sama. Gama salna sanam paraharanaya. Manak sabaha. Shitaya Sabaha Mahashitaya Sabaha Shitayuye Sebaraya Sabaha Niragantaya Sabaha Baraha Mokashingamokaya Sabaha Banamahataya Sabaha Jagara Yoktaya Sabaha Sankasomnanye Modanaya Sabaha Maharagu Tadaraya Sabaha Bamasagantai Sashicheda Garenai Naya Sabaha Myagara Jamani Basanaya Sabaha Namora Dana Daraya Namakarya Baro Gije Sevaraya Sabaha. Okay, so I've split it up into 3 sections here, and this is something I'm still working on. This is not there is clearly 3 different parts of the Great Dharani, and the way that you can divide it up is by the parts that lead up to this. Danyata Om is the standard, one of the standard ways for beginning a Dharani. Now you say, if that's a standard way of beginning a Dharani, what's it doing down here? Well, it's also standard for a Dharani to have an introduction. So if you look at the which I'm not going to bring it up, but if you look at the Medicine Buddha Dharani, there's a section of the Medicine Buddha Dharani that comes before the Danyata Om part. And some people say, oh, you should only do the part that starts with Danyata Om, but that's being too. You can do that. So if you do the kind of the Tibetan the Tibetan pronunciation of the short form of the Medicine Buddha Sutra, it's just Teata Om Bekanse Maha Bekanse Raja Samagate Soha. And that's leaving off the part that comes before the Teata Om. But you can do it either way. With the Medicine Buddha Sutra, and I think with the Medicine Buddha Dharani, and with Dharanis in general, there's usually or often some sort of a introduction. And so this part up here is the title, Shinmyo Jangu De Dharani. That's the actual title of the Dharani. And then there's an introductory part. And then you get to what I'm calling here the inner Dharani, which is the part that starts with Danyata. This is the Sino-Korean way of pronouncing Teata, or however it's pronounced in Sanskrit, which just means literally in Sanskrit. This is one of the first places where you can tell for sure that the Great Dharani isn't just a meaningless string of meaningless syllables. Danyata means in Sanskrit, it goes like this. and so one of the ways that one of the standard ways of starting a mantra is you say it goes like this, and then you say Om. And so some people even say, if it doesn't say Teata Om at the beginning and then Sabaha at the end, then it's not really a mantra. And then sometimes people will go to the extent of taking something that doesn't have Om at the beginning or Sabaha at the end and just put them there. Say, okay, now it's a mantra. But in this case, it's not necessary. You have Danyata Om right here. And then this goes on for a while. And then you get down here, and this is clearly a different section because this is the Sabaha section. There's 13, I believe. In fact, you go through, there's 13 Sabahas, which means there's actually 13 little mantras packed into this part of the Dharani. And so the introduction, the part that starts with Danyata Om, and the part that has all of the Sabahas in it, it makes a logical structure for this Dharani. Now, one of the things that I've done is I marked in red another way you can tell for sure that the Great Dharani isn't just a meaningless string of meaningless syllables. Niraganta is Nilakanta in Sanskrit. It means the blue-necked one, the one who has a blue neck. Nilakanta is a Sanskrit word which literally means blue neck. I think it's neck blue. I think Nila is neck actually, and Kanta is blue. I might have that backwards, but I remember many years ago sitting in my little living room before we moved into the house that we're in now, with the guy who was Indian, and Indian. He was a student who was here in the United States. He back in India now, and someone asked me, "Oh, what is this Great Dharani? What does it mean?" And I gave the party line answer at that time. I said, "Oh, it doesn't mean anything." And the Indian guy, he spoke up, he says, "Oh, this part right here, Nilakanta, Niraganta, I recognize that, because he knew some Sanskrit, and actually, even if you just know Hindi, you might be able to recognize that. Or actually, even anybody who is a Hindu will recognize Nilakanta, because that is one of the names of Shiva. Shiva is the blue-necked one, and this is an attribute of Shiva that kind of got transferred from Hinduism to Buddhism, from Shiva to Avalokiteshvara. Avalokiteshvara actually has a lot of similarities to Shiva, but the reason why Shiva is the blue-necked one is because at the beginning of every kalpa, have you ever heard this word kalpa? In lots of sutras and Buddhist teachings have this word kalpa in it, which is basically kalpa is a Sanskrit word for a really long time. But actually it has a more precise meaning than that. Kalpa means how long a world system lasts. And so world systems come into being, and when a world system first comes into being, Shiva comes. Every world system has a Shiva. And Shiva comes in and takes in all of the worst poisons in that world system and swallows them, but actually holds them in his throat. And so that turns his neck blue. And so for the lifetime of that world system, Shiva holds all those toxins in his body. And then at the end of the world system, Shiva disgorges the toxins back, and that's part of the destruction of the world system. So the blue-necked one is a very, it's a mythological type of savior figure who takes in upon himself, or in the case of, when Avalokiteshvara became Kwanzaa Bosal, Kuan Yin herself, takes in all those toxins, and other than turning his or her neck blue, it doesn't do any harm, but it does have that effect. Turns the neck blue. So Niraganta is one of the places where you can see in the Great Dharani that it is definitely not just a string. So now we've got, well, the title is not part of the Dharani itself. Oops. The title is not part of the Dharani itself. And so when you, Shinmyo Janggu De Dharani is not Sanskrit, it's actually Chinese. And Shin means divine, Myo means subtle and mysterious. Janggu means phrase, De means great, and Dharani means Dharani. So the Shinmyo Janggu De Dharani means the Dharani, the great Dharani that is made up of subtle and mysterious divine phrases. And that's one of the things. So that's generally true for any mantra or Dharani is going to have a title, and it's good to know the title. And usually when Zen Master Sung San taught people mantras, he would and this is the way it's done, as far as I know, in most of East Asia, at least in Korean Buddhism, when you recite a mantra, you recite the title of the mantra first, and then you recite the mantra 3 or 108 or however many times. I usually whenever I recite the Great Dharani more than once, I go ahead and include the title every time I do it, just because at least that's how I'm used to doing it, and I've heard recordings of other people doing the Great Dharani multiple times. So I always start with Shin Myo Jangu because that's just part of the song, as you could tell. And I apologize for subjecting everybody to my sing-songy chanting, but that's the only I can't remember it without the tune. I just cannot. It's part of the chant as far as as far as my mind and my ears and my mouth are concerned. Without using the tune, I can't do it. And the beginning with the Shin Myo Jangu De Dharani, and whenever you're practicing with a group that uses a moktak to keep time for the chant, you might notice that the moktak person hits the moktak 8 times before the Great Dharani, and you might also notice that the moktak person hits the moktak 10 times before we start the Heart Sutra. And that's because the title of the Great Dharani has 8 syllables, and the title of the Heart Sutra has 10 syllables. And so that's the pattern, I guess. You hit you Shin Myo Jangu De Dharani. Yep, 8 syllables. I count them. So, let's see. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about other pieces that we can pull out here and identify. And there's actually a lot more, and I'm still working on this because the people who have gone through, some scholars have made an effort to kind of figure out what this what this Dharani means. Now, another way that that you can tell that this Dharani is not just a meaningless string of meaningless sounds is that actually the very first English translation of the Great Dharani was done back in the 1930s by D.T. Suzuki. He published it in a book called A Manual of Zen Buddhism, where he actually has a whole chapter on Dharanis. It includes this Dharani, the Great Dharani, very prominently. It also includes the Dharani that we chant as part of the Kwanseum Bosal chant and the Jijang Bosal chant, the long part, the long one, the Bulso Soje Gelsang Dharani Namu Samada Motanam Abaraji Hadasa, etc., etc. Etc., etc. is Latin, not Sanskrit. But the and then there's one other one in there. I can't remember which one, but he includes a translation of the Great Dharani there, and his translation is not considered to be very good. But at the same time, the people who've come along later and come up with what are generally considered to be better, more accurate translations of the Great Dharani, they start with Suzuki because he was the first one to really, at least to come up with an English translation. He was the first one to go where no one had gone before and try to do that. And he was also the one who made it clear to people, at least anybody who was paying attention, that even though I've said this, I'm going to say it one more time, that the Great Dharani is not just a meaningless string of meaningless sounds. that there are parts of it that are probably untranslatable, but most of it is definitely translatable. Okay, so we should take a 5-minute break at this point. We'll come back and we'll talk more about the Great Dharani, and there's lots more to say about it. Sure. Right. Let's see. So let's see. We don't need that there. Let's see. We'll chant it again at the end. We're not going to chant it right now. Okay. Let's bring the this back over here. I'm not going to look at this yet. Oh yeah. So as we as let's see. Yeah. So yeah, there's a couple of other things that can be pretty easily identified in here. And this slide, so Mahagarunikaya is Mahakarunikaya, which is Karuna. So it's great. It's great. It's a, I think in Sanskrit it's like an adjective form. The ya at the end, I believe. I could easily be wrong about that, but the ya is stuck on the end, or even Karunikaya. Yeah, I don't know enough Sanskrit to know why but I recognize Karuna, and Karunikaya is derived from Karuna, and Maha Karunikaya, Maha, which is another thing that shows up actually many times in the let's see how many times we got Maha in here. Two, three, four, five, six, seven. So 7 mahas. And so every time you see maha, that's just Sanskrit for great. And so that shows up many times in the mantra. And Mahakarunikaya is one of the places where it shows up, great compassion. It's the great compassionate Dharani. And that's part of its name. Oh, also another thing that shows up when we say Shunyo Jangu De Dharani, the very first thing after that is Namo Ra Dana Dara Yaya. That means homage to the 3 jewels. It's the correct, let's see. Oh yeah. Namo Ra Dana Daraya, right here, is Namo Ratna Trayaya, which you'll see in a lot of Dharanis and mantras, often right at the very beginning. Homage to the 3 jewels. And then right after that is Namakarya Baro Gije Sevaraya, which is homage to Avalokiteshvara. And Baro Gije, this series of syllables here, Baro Gije, is kind of part of Avalokiteshvara's name when it's kind of the pronunciation of it in Sino-Korean, but by itself, it's also a way of saying bodhisattva. So Barogije, outside of being embedded in the name of Avalokiteshvara, also shows up, and Mahagarunika. Oh yeah, that's right. Barogije bodhisattva, Niraganta is Nilakanta. Let's see if there's any others that I've. Garunika, Danyata, Om. Yeah. Okay. So. That's kind of a good start for just establishing that we know that there's more that I'm still working through. Now, one of the problems is that the people, I think I might have mentioned this already, but the people who've done the most work of sorting out what the original Sanskrit really was and what that Sanskrit means, they have focused not on the Korean version of the Great Dharani, which is actually kind of different. It's a little different. They focused on the version that everybody else uses, which is the one that D.T. Suzuki translated. It's the one that Japanese Buddhists use, Chinese Buddhists, and Vietnamese Buddhists use a slightly different one. And actually, in a lot of places, it's not. It's different enough that it makes it difficult to, because what you have to do is you have to take the form in which people are chanting it, which is just kind of spelled out phonetically, um, and then try to figure out what the original what the original Sanskrit was for that, and then figure out what the Sanskrit means. So that's what uh, DT Suzuki did, and then the other person who's really made the biggest contribution to this is, I'm leaning down here to get this book. The author of this book. This is the Thousand Armed Avalokiteshvara. It's a big book. This is the big book on the Great Dharani. So it's by a Sanskrit scholar named Lokesh Chandra, who is really a great Sanskrit scholar. I mean, I don't, I'm not qualified to evaluate how great a Sanskrit scholar is, but he seems to be a really great one. And he's the one, and he's written the book on the Great Dharani. And he talks about the Korean version, and he actually has two long sections where he reproduces two different chanting books from Korea, from Korean Buddhist temples, showing the Great Dharani as it's chanted in Korea. But he also says, but it's different. And so he focuses on the one that's not different, which is the one that is used in Japan and China and Vietnam. And so that does create a little bit of trouble, but I'm trying to sort through it. So one other important thing, and I mentioned this before. Let's see, what do I have here? Oh yeah, so I went through and I looked up some other. So Dharani, the meaning of the word Dharani is. I mean, actually, so the word Dharani does have a meaning in Sanskrit. It means to hold. Okay, and so when it's used to refer to something that is kind of like a mantra, what does that mean? And so there's lots of different explanations for why the word for holding something is used synonymously with mantras. But that can be a distraction from the fact that really when people talk about Dharanis, they're talking about the same thing that we usually talk about when we talk about mantras. Now, sometimes Dharanis are longer. Get back into slideshow. Sometimes Dharanis are longer than mantras, not necessarily. And that's a very quick and dirty definition of mantra, or of Dharani, is that it's a long mantra. Now there are people who claim to know what the Sanskrit word mantra actually means. Those definitions are pretty well. I mean, I'm not a Sanskrit scholar. It's even ridiculous to say I'm not a Sanskrit scholar, but at the same time, I know enough about Sanskrit and I know enough about mantras to know that the explanations that people give, they say, "Oh, this is what the word mantra means," that they're just making it up, basically. And there isn't an accepted um, definition of what the Sanskrit word mantra means. Everybody knows what a mantra is, right? And everybody knows what a dharani is. It's something that you do. It's a practice that you do. It's something that you repeat. But in Buddhism, there is kind of a catch, and that is that the mantras and dharanis that are used in Buddhism all come from the teachings of the Buddha. They're not just things that people made up, said, "Oh, here's a mantra I think you should try." They're all things that come from the teachings of the Buddha. Even though sometimes, as happens in many sutras, the mantra is coming from some other being, some other bodhisattva, as in the case of the Great Dharani, it comes from Avalokiteshvara. You know, In the case of the medicine Buddha Dharani, it comes from Shakyamuni Buddha. He's the one who taught the medicine Buddha Dharani. But anyway, so I have here, I did before it got away from me. Yeah, I have here. You might have, I don't know if you've ever seen these explanations for mantras. So, Om Horo Horo Sayamoke Sabaha. That's a mantra that we chant towards the end of either Jijang Bosal chanting or Kwanzaa Bosal chanting. In fact, it's the second to last mantra. Okay, and Zen Master Sung San would tell people this is an extra mantra, like an extra button on a shirt. It's used as a preventive measure, even if things are going well. And the reason why I want to point this out is just to point out that this is an interesting sort of explanation for the mantra, but it's not really what the mantra is. This mantra has that. This is the mantra for repairing mistakes, and the reason why it's chanted second to last in not just in Kwanzaa Bosal and Jijang Bosal chanting, but in a lot of practices, is because before you end your practice, you want to recite this mantra in case you've made mistakes. And it's a very standard Mahayana Buddhist practice to. There's more than one mantra for repairing mistakes. This is actually probably the shortest one. There's some much longer ones, but it's good to know and so when we chant the mantra in Jijang Bosal chanting or Kwanzaa Bosal chanting, we say Bogol Jiron, and then we say Om Horo Horo Maya Om Horo Horo Sayamoke Sabaha. Bogol Jiron literally means repair mistakes mantra. That's what it means. And so in one thing that's interesting in Chinese, when the Chinese translated the word mantra into Chinese, they made up a new word in Chinese. They made up a new word out of two existing words in Chinese, jin and on. And jin means true and on means words. And so when Chinese Buddhists decided to come up with their own term for mantra, they called mantras true words. And there's some people who have actually tried to find some way that you can make the Sanskrit mantra mean true words as well. But it's very clear. In this character here, pronounced in Sino-Korean as Jin, and this character here, pronounced in Sino-Korean as Un. Everybody knows, everybody who can read Chinese characters knows the meaning of these characters. This means true and this means words. So there's no ambiguity about what Jin On means. And it's a really great term for mantras. It's true words. Anyway, so Om Horo Horo Sayamoke Sabaha. So why do you have an extra button on a shirt? You have an extra button on a shirt in case one of the buttons falls off, right? In case there's some problem or error or mistake or something that needs to be corrected. So this is kind of an interesting way of describing what the mantra is about, but it's important for people to know that it literally is the mantra for correcting mistakes. That even and the reason why it's good to have this is because people can get very hung up on whether or not they're pronouncing a mantra correctly. And this is a mantra to help alleviate those fears. You should try to pronounce it as well as you can, but don't let your incorrect pronunciation stop you from doing it. Okay, so Om Jare Jure Junje Sabaha Burim. So this is what Zen Master Sung San told people, that this is a mantra used for universal mystical energy. It can help you to see through to your aspirations, which is true. But it's also important to know that it's called the Junje Jinon. It is Junje Bosal's mantra. Let's see. Om Saba Mocha Moji Sadaya Sabaha. This is the universal repentance mantra. And again, Chamhe Jinon is the title of it, and it literally means repentance mantra. And I didn't get the title in this one. Om Samara Samara Mimara Jarama Ja Gorabaraham. This is the Bogol Jinon. This is the explanation that Zen Master Sung San gave us, that this is the last mantra in a ceremony. As the ceremony is complete mantra, it's the dedication of merit mantra. That's what Bulgwal Jinon means, universal sharing of merit. Okay, so I'm pointing this out because Zen Master Sung San was also the one who told people that the Great Dharani can't be translated, and it doesn't have any meaning, and so he could be a little fast and loose. He wanted people to do these practices, and he wanted to do them without a lot of thinking, without a lot of getting hung up on, well, what are we doing? Because in fact, when people in Korea do the Great Dharani, they believe that it's going to bring good luck. I mean, that's what people do the Great Dharani for. That's why it's so popular. It's going to help them. And uh, Westerners often tend to get a little, uh, uh, what? They say, how can that work? Yeah. So Western Buddhists often are very skeptical. It's good to be skeptical, but at the same time, it's not so good to let your thinking get in the way. Let your skepticism get in the way. So Zen Master Sung San tried to overcome people's potential problems or skepticism by just saying, and this was his general, approach, just do it. So, and then people would say, well, what does this mantra mean? He would say, oh, this is like an extra button. What does this mantra mean? This mantra is just the end of ceremony mantra. What does this mantra mean? And so these are often quoted and reproduced by people saying this is what this mantra is, but actually there's a lot more to it than that. And this is the case with the Great Dharani as well. Oh yeah, and here is the yeah, that's another one, but I'm not going to go into that anymore. That's enough. So here is the sutra that the Great Dharani comes from. Now, it's reasonable to be a little skeptical about these sutras that accompany any particular Dharani. It isn't necessarily the case that, well, it's possible that in some cases sutras were written afterwards to kind of prop up the status or the official status of a mantra, because properly speaking, any mantra or dharani, at least for a Buddhist, should be something that is a teaching of the Buddha, a teaching that is associated, that comes from the sutras. Now, that isn't always the case. So the Kanzeon Sutra, which is just it's just flat out, people call it a sutra. It's not a sutra. It's not in any sutra. Nobody knows for sure where the chant originated. Well, probably the best story of where the Kanzeon Sutra came from is that it did come from Kwanzaa Bosal, but she taught it to people in their dreams. There are actually in Zen, there are stories of people, of Zen masters who've received transmission in their dreams. Yeah, I can believe that that's possible. If somebody came along and told me that they had received transmission in a dream, I would not necessarily take the word for it. But anyway, I want to go up. But it is interesting to know that there is a sutra in which the Great Dharani is taught, and this sutra, the Great Compassion Dharani Sutra, let's see, also known as the thousand-handed and thousand-eyed Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva's vast, perfect, unimpeded, great compassionate heart Dharani Sutra. That's the full title. And there's probably an even longer title than that. And it starts out like all sutras, thus have I heard. Once Shakyamuni Buddha was at Potalaka Mountain. Now, Potalaka is a very important location associated with Avalokiteshvara, and associated in particular with the form of Avalokiteshvara who taught this Dharani. And so the Potalaka Mountain is a there are places in East Asia that are called Potalaka Mountains. In fact, I think there's a place in Korea that's called Potalaka Mountain. But these were named after this mythological place. Okay, it's like Sumeru Mountain. um, or Vulture Peak. There is a place in India, I believe, that people say, "Oh, this is Vulture Peak. This is where the Buddha taught the uh, the Lotus Sutra." But I don't think anybody really knows for sure whether that's true. But anyway, so this is a mythological place where the Great Dharani was first taught by Avalokiteshvara, and there's a there's a just want to. Oh yeah, here we go. So when Avalokiteshvara is explaining about the Great Dharani, Avalokiteshvara gives a number of practices, or at least some additional practices that you're supposed to do along with the Great Dharani. And so the things that are included in the sutra, uh, where Avalokiteshvara says, after making these vows, recite my name with deep felt sincere effort and recite single-mindedly the name of my teacher, Amitabha. Okay, so in this particular story, uh, uh, Avalokiteshvara, the great bodhisattva, is being presented as a student of Amitabha Buddha. And then, so after making these vows that are up here, may I quickly know all the dharmas, may I soon attain the wisdom eye, etc., etc. And if I go toward the mountain of knives, the mountain of knives of itself breaks up. Okay, so after reciting these vows and then reciting the name of Avalokiteshvara and reciting the name of Amitabha, then recite this mantra. Okay, and so if you do the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra chant, that's all this extra stuff, along with a lot of other stuff, is included in the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra chant. So one of the reasons why the Great Dharani is part of the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra is because the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra includes this stuff that you're supposed to do before you do the Great Dharani, which, of course, we often don't do all this stuff before doing the Great Dharani, and that's okay. But if you really want to do it right, which is also okay, then you can do this extra stuff. And if you want to include a bunch of other good stuff, then you just do the Thousand Hands and Eye Sutra, and it includes the Great Dharani. And a common thing for people to do is that they will do the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra, and I'll talk more about in the next class. I will talk more about the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra. I'm kind of referring to it as if people, I know Elizabeth knows this. So Elizabeth has chanted the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra many times. I don't know how familiar you are with it at all, Deborah, or other people who are watching this, but it's one of the chants that Zen Master Sung San taught. He called it part of special chanting. And so the chants that we do, like in our local little group on Wednesday nights, that Zen Master Sung San called that regular chanting. Except we include the Kanzeon chant, which Zen Master Sung San didn't teach, but what Zen Master Degak does teach. And so we include the Kanzeon chant along with the rest of what Zen Master Sung San taught as regular chanting. And then on Saturdays, we do the Jijang Bosal chant, which is part of what Zen Master Sung San taught as special chanting. So special chanting would be one of these, would Kanzen Bosal or Jijang Bosal chanting, and then the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra. Yeah, which is the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra is like about 15 minutes long to chant the whole thing. It's quite a long sutra. Anyway, so I want to say one more thing about. Oh yeah, it goes on. There are a bunch of other practices that are suggested for people who are going to do the Great Dharani. There's also all kinds of wonderful benefits that are described for people who practice the Great Dharani. And then, like, you will not die of starvation. Good, that's good, right? Okay. when in future lives, you will always be born in a place that has a good king, as opposed to a really, really bad king, which there are. And then here's the so this is so finally it gets to the part where Avalokiteshvara teaches the Dharani itself, and this is the version of the Dharani, which is a little different, and in parts quite a bit different from the version that the Korean version. This is the more the widely used version. Let's see. Yeah, so I'm going to talk more about this this sutra in future classes. Let's see, and talk more about the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra. I just want to bring up something else that I'm going to talk more about in future classes if I can find it. Oh yeah, here it is. So I showed this book. This book is very difficult to get. There's no electronic version of it that I know of. It's more or less out of print, and if you find a copy of it, it'll probably cost like $80 or maybe more than that. I don't recommend running out and buying that book, unless you're really into expensive books, expensive, kind of arcane books. But this is an article that you can find easily if you how did I find this article? Let me show you how you find this article. You go Lokesh Chandra Nilakanta Dharani. Oh yeah, I should also one other thing I should show is the Wikipedia page. Actually, this Dharani, I hate Wikipedia. Just let me just get that out there. I really don't like the Wikipedia, except when it's good, And so the Wikipedia page for this Dharani is really good, with one significant problem. If you go to the if you just do a Google search on Great Dharani, let's see, I might have sorted this out. Here's the Great Dharani Sutra. And I'm not sure which if that's the same sutra as the one I was looking at before, because obviously Great Dharani is a fairly generic term. The Wikipedia page that you want that actually has a lot of good information is the Wikipedia page for the Nilakanta. So remember when I said that Niraganta was a phrase that my Indian friend immediately recognized and said, no, you shouldn't tell people that this Dharani doesn't mean anything, because I know what this word means. It shows up 3 times and it means the blue-necked one. And so this is the Wikipedia page for the Nilakanta Dharani, and this is actually mostly really good information. There is I'm sorry, I'm scrolling through this really fast because I'm scrolling down to the Korean section. There's a Korean section for this, which I did not use when I put, oh yeah, Bhagavad Dharmas. That's the shorter version. Amoghavajra. This is the version that most people in East Asia use, is the one that is attributed to Amoghavajra. And then there is the Chinese version, Vietnamese version, Japanese Soto Zen version. See, there's people really like the Great Dharani. D.T. Suzuki's translation, Kaz Tanahashi and Joan Halifax, they have a translation. I shouldn't disparage them, but this is here's the Korean version. Okay, so this Hangul has at least one typo in it, unless they've corrected it. I didn't correct it because I don't like to get into arguments with people on Wikipedia by correcting their stuff. But if you can read Hangul, and this is the romanization. Anyway, the information that's in the Wikipedia page for the Nilakanta Dharani has a lot of good stuff for anybody who's interested in the Great Dharani. And then I think the last thing I want to talk about is just mention and look at a little bit more is where is it? I had it up here. Oh yeah, I know how to find it. Like I was doing before, you do Lokesh Chandra, and that's what I got off track because if you do Lokesh Chandra, Nilakanta Dharani, so Lokesh Chandra is the author, the Sanskrit scholar. If you scroll down a little bit, oh yeah, I think is this the article? Oh no, this is it. The origin of Avalokiteshvara Potala. Okay, so this article is free online, and so this has a lot of the most important stuff that's in Lokesh Chandra's big, almost impossible to find, very expensive book is in this free PDF that anybody can read online or download for themselves. And yeah, so I think that's about enough. I want to save a little bit of time for us to chant the Great Dharani together again as we close. But are there questions or any kind of comments or so please think about what you want to know about the Great Dharani or about Dharanis in general. Yeah. I mean, and one thing to consider is is it okay to just chant it without knowing what it means and without wanting to know what it means? And then there's also the question of, what actual value is there in chanting mantras and dharanis? And so usually the people who say that mantras and dharanis are completely meaningless are the same people who say that chanting them is completely meaningless. The chant is meaningless and the practice is meaningless. Anyway. Okay, so now I am going to find the Great Dharani again. The Great Dharani of divine and sublime praises. Bye. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Great to
Thanks.
see you, and see you next time.
Okay.